I was very intrigued a couple of weeks ago when I heard that the
That's
group was
fine.
going to talk about staging. And first, because I thought it was a very interesting topic. Second, because I'm still trying to figure out how to do staging on my own lines. So I thought I would share a little bit of that tonight and hopefully get some advice along the way as to some of the things that I'm doing. In order to talk about staging on the Blackhawk lines, I thought it was important to start by showing how the railroad fits into the real world. So let me go ahead and do that. And let's see if there we go. Blackhawk lines, I really tried to fit into the real world. I view it as kind of a proto-freelanced layout prototype in the sense that I've tried to follow some real geography and some real railroad lines to pick some cities that actually existed, try to follow track plans wherever I could. But it's freelance in the sense that what I picked was a combination or really a joint trackage arrangement between the Chicago Northwestern and the Illinois Central. I grew up in a Northwestern town. I'm probably a little partial to the Northwestern, but I like both of them very much. And I found the prototype idea for this in a magazine a number of years ago. I've kind of expanded on it. So let me take this map and try and explain it a little bit. The Blackhawk lines generally follows what would be called the Illinois Central Iowa Division. Starts in Chicago, heads west toward Rockford, Illinois, through Freeport, up almost into Wisconsin, down through Galena to the Mississippi River, up to East Dubuque, which is called Dunleaf on the Blackhawk lines, its historical name. Crosses the river, loops through Dubuque, and then generally heads west across Iowa to Omaha, Sioux Falls, and Sioux City. So that's the Blackhawk lines, but the trick was, because I grew up in a town called Belvedere, a little east of Rockford, and because I'm partial to the Northwestern, I decided that the Blackhawk lines was really going to be a joint operation of Northwestern and Illinois Central, and it would follow Northwestern trackage east of Freeport and the Illinois Central route west of Freeport and out across Iowa. So that's the general layout for the Blackhawk lines road, but interchange is an important characteristic, and the Blackhawk interchanges with two railroads primarily, the Burlington Northern and the Milwaukee Road. Now I'm modeling early 90s, and I know the Milwaukee Road would have been Sioux Line by that point, but grant me a little bit of modeler's license in this. There are a couple of routes that we follow. The BN is represented by this blue line over here on the left-hand side of the chart, and it starts in Wisconsin, goes through Rochelle, Illinois to Savannah, up along the Mississippi through East Dubuque, and then on up the east side of the river through Wisconsin toward Minneapolis. Notice there's also a connecting line from Savannah that goes south toward Galesburg, and then on down, from Galesburg, both east and west on the BN, as well as south toward Centralia, Illinois. Milwaukee Road, there are a couple of key routes on here. The main Milwaukee Road route is the road west from Chicago, through Davis Junction to Savannah and Sebula, Iowa. And the Milwaukee Road then went west across Iowa. The other key route for our purposes here today is a Milwaukee Road line that ran from Savannah up to Minneapolis along the west side of the Mississippi through Dubuque, and also south and southwest from Sebula toward Kansas City. Now I take advantage of that to run some interchange trains on the Milwaukee. And finally on the Milwaukee, there's a branch that cut off this little place called Kittredge. Actually ran up through Freeport, through Beloit, Wisconsin, and continued on toward Milwaukee. So I take advantage of that branch also to show some interchange with the Milwaukee. Milwaukee also had a line that ran from Beloit through Rockford and connected with its main line at Davis Junction. So that's how the Blackhawk fits into the real world and kind of sets the stage for how we do staging, pun intended. Here's a simplified view of what I showed you on the previous chart. On the right lower side here is Chicago. But Chicago is not just one location, it's a number of locations for both Northwestern, Illinois Central, and the BN. So cars can be routed to any one of those Chicago locations. Likewise, in Iowa, we have a number of specific destinations: Owine, Des Moines, North Platte, for the Northwestern, as well as destinations for the IC. I have Cedar Rapids in Iowa and Belt Clearing in Chicago that are kind of stuck by themselves. On the Blackhawk lines, cars that are routed for those destinations can travel in either IC or Northwestern trains. Notice that the Milwaukee and the BN actually form an X as they cross the Blackhawk to provide the interchange. So Blackhawk is this major black line going east and west. BN and the Milwaukee both cross the Blackhawk, traveling from Minneapolis to Savannah, and then finally the Milwaukee branch going up here to Milwaukee. That's a little bit busy and a little bit complicated, but it does follow some of the real world, and it is the basis for what I'm trying to do on the Blackhawk lines. Any questions? Then we'll carry on. So on the Blackhawk, we have 5 staging yards that we use, and I'll talk about each one in a little bit more detail. But Chicago provides us with Northwestern and Illinois Central terminals and connections to the east and the south. Iowa provides connections for CNW and IC, along with connections to the west and the southwest. Minneapolis provides connections for the BN, with connections west and northwest. And then Savannah, because of its position, serves both BN and Milwaukee, and from Savannah we can provide connections basically in all directions: east, southeast, southwest, southwest, and actually northwest on the Milwaukee. Now, if that doesn't confuse my operators, yeah, it does. But that's part of the fun of the operation. Finally, Milwaukee, we also have staging for a single Milwaukee train, which in theory travels on from Rockford toward Wisconsin and then comes back to Rockford as a different train. Key point here is that all of the trains, when they reach staging, terminate and then are rebuilt in between sessions. So here's the same picture that we looked at, or the same graphic that we looked at a couple of minutes ago, but on this one I've expanded the Blackhawk lines to show individual towns and stations along the Blackhawk line. So represented on the Blackhawk, the part that's the Blackhawk that's modeled, starting with Rockford. Freeport is actually a division point, major yard. Several other smaller towns. We make it to Dubuque, Iowa, which is another division point. And after leaving Dubuque, we travel toward Iowa staging. The BN crosses and actually shares trackage with the Blackhawk for short distance through Portage Junction and Dunleavy, and then it travels on into Savannah. Milwaukee Road, in theory, travels from Minneapolis through Dubuque to Savannah and on to Kansas City. In essence, we play a game here, and I terminate one train in Dubuque, then create a new train that travels from Dubuque to Milwaukee, returns from Milwaukee to Dubuque, and then travels on toward Savannah, or terminates in Dubuque, continues as a new train, and travels on through Savannah to Kansas City. So again, it's a little bit tricky to follow. It sort of follows the prototype, but it does give us a lot of opportunity for interchange. So this is the main staging area for the Blackhawk lines. It's at the entrance to the room, and this picture shows 3 staging yards. Up on top, Chicago. Here in the middle is Iowa, and down underneath is Minneapolis. So that's 3 of the 5, and I'll show you the other 2 as we go along. A couple of weeks ago, Chuck Hart talked about the functionality of staging yards, and here's how that applies on the Blackhawk. Chicago and Iowa are both open-ended or open stub staging yards with 8 tracks each. Both are approximately 20 feet long. Minneapolis is a covered 8 to 10 foot stub yard with 4 tracks and 5 short storage tracks. I'll show you that in a minute. And then Savannah is covered but is very accessible. It's actually 3 very long tracks in a double-ended yard within a reversing loop. And finally, Rockford is a single hidden stub track of approximately 8 feet. And that's just used to hold a single train. Comment on the chart. Blackhawk lines defines a typical car length as being 55 feet. We're operating on the Blackhawk in the early 90s, between 90 and 95. And cars were a little bit longer. We're getting bigger in this period of time, and Blackhawk has an awful lot of covered hoppers, 55-foot covered hoppers, and so we picked 55 feet as a typical car length. I'm running with cars that are both longer and shorter than 55 feet. So I said that staging occurred primarily between sessions. On the Blackhawk, our sessions are continuous. We start the fast clock at the beginning, stop it at the end of the session. Trains are left in place until the next session occurs. But the terminated trains are actually rebuilt, not just turned, but rebuilt in between sessions. And in fact, most of the work on restaging takes place in this time period. For cars that were delivered to customers, waybills are typically flipped from empty to full. I use a 2-sided waybill, so I show loads and empties on a waybill. When a load is delivered, the card gets flipped to empty, and then, according to the card, is routed back typically to the shipper on a reverse route. And I'll talk some more about how that works in a minute. One of the things that I'm struggling with at the moment is that although I have generally left working with waybills to the restaging in between sessions, we've now created an operational change where some of the cars are actually changed during the session. In particular, I have a transload elevator in Dubuque. Grain carts get delivered to Cargill in Dubuque for transload to barge. So those cars come in full. During the session, they're emptied, and they need to be moved during the session, otherwise Dubuque gets plugged. So one of the jobs is to be the Cargill yard operator. That may not be a long-term or full-time job during the session, but it will keep somebody busy for a while as those cars come in and out. But those cars need to be rerouted out of Dubuque, and rather than just flip waybills, I like to reroute the cars as much as possible. So that involves changing some of the waybills, but again, from full to empty. also create a crew sign-up sheet, and that has a list of both scheduled and extra trains that I expect to run during the session. I build a briefing sheet that includes some general information, both for newbies to the session as well as information about changes to the layout that may have occurred since the last session for regular operators. I try to check the layout, make sure that problems that were uncovered in the previous session were addressed, and make sure as much as possible that the layout is ready for operation, and trains and engines and trackage are good to go. So when we rebuild trains during in-between sessions, the first thing I do is turn the trains around in order to preserve the power consists. I have a Digitrax system. I can do consisting. I do both Digitrax universal consisting as well as advanced consisting for those consists that have all sound. And it's a lot easier to preserve those consists and reuse them from session to session, but occasionally I do like to change consists around, and I'll do that in between sessions. Now, at the staging yards, then the trains can either be partially or completely rebuilt and reblocked for departure. Cars can get new waybills, or I may simply flip the waybill and change it from load to empty. I do move the cars. I can move the cars to different trains or take them off the layout for a couple of sessions before putting them back in operation. A couple of rules for cars that I try to follow, and this isn't 100%, but in general, I'll try to route cars that would have been in IC trains or IC home road cars to the IC trains, and Northwestern cars to the Northwestern trains. I'll generally try to route foreign empties back to the home road, unless I can find a new way to load them and send them someplace else. And generally, I'll try to look for cars from appropriate roads in order to bring on loads online to customers. I've used my version of what are called 4-part waybills. Most of you are familiar with 4-part waybills. I don't use those, but one of the things that bothered me in operation was having cars go from the end locations directly to staging. Rockford and Dubuque are one stop from the staging yards. It bothered me to have a loaded car leave Rockford, go to Chicago, have the waybill flipped, and then have the car come right back to Rockford in the next session. That bothered me. So generally, I will take those cars and pull the waybill and give it a whole new assignment, probably putting it in a different train. Although occasionally I will, particularly if I'm in a hurry to get ready for a session, I will just flip the waybill and send it back to Rockford anyway. But I try to reroute some of these cars so they don't, as much as possible, do not just go back and forth between staging and a destination online. Finally, one of the rules I have is that I do have some cars I haven't quite decided where they're going or what they're doing, so they travel without waybills, and those are considered to be through cars, and they follow the train to the destination. Those cars may simply travel the layout from end to end until I can find a use for them, and then I'll give them a waybill and send them to a destination. Comments or questions so far?
One question on your charts.
Yes.
There were letters of, let's say Minneapolis was N1. Are those station numbers or
Those
blocking numbers?
those are TIPS codes. You can treat them as in very much the same way that you treat a particular code for a customer online. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a couple of charts.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
How many operators do you typically have?
Thank you, Greg. That's a great question. I've struggled with this and I've adopted as I've gone along. When I started, I was having generally 12 to 15 operators. I've tried to cut that back. My ideal number is probably between 8 and 12 operators. The railroad seems to be most fluid with that number of operators. We get a lot of work done. We move a number of trains. We kind of avoid congestion both in the aisles and on the railroad with a smaller number of operators. So 8 to 12 is the ideal range for me. Okay, here again is the main staging area with Chicago up on top, Iowa in the middle, and Minneapolis down below. We'll look at each one of the staging yards now in a little bit more detail. Here's Chicago. There are 8 tracks. Notice that, notice the train on track 1 is without an engine. It came into staging a little too long for staging. So the train was turned, and the power that came in on that train is actually parked on track 3 at the moment. The train has been turned, but it has not yet been rebuilt. When it is rebuilt prior to the next session, some of the cars will come out of this train. It will be shorter when it goes out. It will fit on the staging track before it goes out. Over here also on track 6 is an intermodal train that's ready to go. The train fits on the track okay, but when I add the power, it fouls the switch. So I took the power off the train, and it's also sitting back here on track 3 at the moment. It will be added to the train before it departs. One comment here is, and I've heard a number of people say this, staging tracks are a little bit like cars on your railroad. You could never have enough of them. And I would say that's probably a true statement. I could use more staging tracks, but I found that during a session, I typically move only 3, possibly 4 trains out of staging during a session. If I move 4 trains out of a staging yard during a session, that's a bunch. Most of those will go across the railroad and go to the other staging yards. So it turns out to be kind of a swap of trains from end to end. I do try to keep one track open in the staging yard if I can, so that I've got a place to start the next session. But in general, I found that 8 tracks seems to be enough. In fact, over here on track 8, that's mostly storage at the moment. I'm sorry, track 7 is mostly storage at the moment. And those are cars that can be put into other trains as they're rebuilt in between sessions. So Chicago and Iowa staging are the primary staging yards. They're very similar. Both of them are 8 tracks and about 20 feet, as I explained earlier. Minneapolis is kind of interesting. It's a little crowded under there. And in hindsight, I wish I'd left a little bit more space between those two. But this does work. I usually build only 1 train in Minneapolis, and that's actually the train that happens to be sitting here right now. It's the La Crosse to Savannah local, and it is built and ready to depart. There is also a grain train that's sitting on behind it on tracks 1 and 2, and that train will have to be doubled before it leaves Minneapolis staging. I did put a note in here. This is Minneapolis staging. The box says Iowa staging. The bill boxes for all 3 railroads are along this one shelf, and that does also cause a little bit of confusion sometimes for operators, but that hasn't been a huge problem as we've gone. From Minneapolis, the entrance to the train room is over through the wall, and you'll see the other side of that a little bit later on. Here's Savannah. Savannah provides staging for both the Milwaukee and the BN. And we see two trains that are ready to go here in Savannah. The BN train, the reverse of the other one. This is the Savannah to La Crosse train. And Milwaukee is actually the Kansas City to Minneapolis train that's ready to depart. Third track in this yard is storage. This, as I said, is built within a reversing loop. The loop goes out here to the top left-hand corner and around the other side of this wall. And it's a very large staging area, and it's a good place for me to park extra cars that I want to have disappear from the layout for a little while. This is a diagram of the overall railroad, dispatcher's diagram, and as you can see, it is a very linear railroad. As I mentioned earlier, it's primarily a bridge route from Chicago to Iowa and to the Union Pacific. Most of the interchange action takes place within these two circles. The one over here at Dunleith and Portage. And this does somewhat mirror the trackage that actually exists along the Mississippi River between Portage Junction and Dunleith or East Dubuque. As this trackage was originally designed, the Illinois Central was there first. Actually, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy came along later with its own road, single track that was parallel. And the railroads finally decided to get together because there was enough trackage on there that they decided to cooperate and run that as double track through that section. So it really was run as and is still run as double track between Portage Junction and East Dubuque or Dunleith. And there is interchange in Dubuque with the BN, and you see BN staging up at the top left of that circle and Savannah staging down to the bottom right. The other staging track that I've mentioned is Milwaukee staging in Rockford, and that is just a single track in Rockford where we park that Milwaukee train, turn it between sessions, and get it ready to go again. Comments?
How long are your trains mostly, car-wise?
Well, I try to keep them to 20 cars when they reach the yard. They can be longer than that during while they're traveling online, but I try to tell my operators, make sure you plan that you can get rid of enough cars out of your train that you don't go to staging with more than 20. Sometimes that works. As you saw a few minutes ago, it doesn't always work.
On the part that's double track, do you do left-hand running?
I really wanted to because of this Northwestern, but I treat that, no, it's not really left-hand running. It's really the flow of the current at that point in time, and trains can go on either direction on either track. Okay.
What is the typical length of a session?
Thank you. I run my sessions at 5 hours. I use a fast clock that is roughly 5/8, or 1 5/8. So a 5-hour clock session turns to be about an 8-hour shift on the railroad.
Okay.
You asked me about the codes earlier, the TIBS codes. TIBS is an acronym, and I think it came from the Santa Fe. I'm not sure of that, but I think it came from the Santa Fe for transfer and block system. And it's a way of routing cars or helping yard masters and station masters route cars to destination. But basically, the railroad is organized from Chicago at the top to the Iowa destinations at the bottom. And every location every destination location is given a Tibbs code from A to Z. So all of the Chicago destinations are A something, Iowa destinations are Z something, and all of the stations on the railroad in order from east to west are given a Tibbs code according to this number. So the online stations basically run from B through P at Peosta. And I've shown the online stations in the tan color, and the offline destinations are in the gray color. Now, if you can figure this out, you should be able to figure out where any train is gone. The waybills have a Tibbs code on the front and the back. And if you route the car toward the Tibbs code and send it there, then you won't have any problem with me in terms of where that car went. K's and N's are basically destinations for the BN and the Milwaukee offline, representing either Minneapolis or Galesburg. So that's how we've done that. Any questions on this? Because it's kind of complicated. I've got a lot of feedback. Some of it's been positive on the Tibbs codes.
My other question would be on the, we just call it a blocking. Tibbs is a new term to me. I've always just heard blocking but now, so you would have a block of cars for particular, let's say Tibbs code. Do you worry about the blocking of the cars within that Tibbs code for particular industries, or not really? Just the Tibbs code itself, and the operator once on that location takes care of let's say taking the block apart and serving the customer.
Let me answer that in two parts because there's a little bit of both in this. And the Tibbs codes work a little bit differently here. You'll see some heavier black line. I hope you can see some heavier black lines on this chart. So as I come down the chart, I've got Chicago up at the top. Then you'll see a group of stations, Belvedere, Rockford, and Rockford-Milwaukee interchange. All of those Tibbs codes, B, C, or C1, can go to Rockford. Then the Rockford operator gets to sort those cars out, make sure they go either delivered to customers in those locations or put into appropriate locations.
Okay.
Likewise, for Freeport, the next block, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, those cards, when they leave staging, all go to Freeport. And they can go to Freeport in any order within the train. They will be a block within the train, but they're not sorted within the train. So
Okay.
they'll go to Freeport and get delivered. Tibbs codes D through J will go to Freeport. Then the Freeport operator gets to sort those cars out for the appropriate destinations, either in Freeport or for the local turn jobs that go out of Freeport to deliver those cars to the different customers in the different cities along the way.
Okay.
Does that kind of
Yes,
answer?
it does. That answers it. I understand.
Okay. Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. For the turn jobs that go out of Freeport, those cars will be blocked within those trains before leaving Freeport. So we call them fur balls, and there's a reason for that. The west fur ball leaves Freeport, serves Galena, Apple River, Scales Mound, and Galena, 4 towns. So the trains in that, or the cars in that train, will be blocked in order by town before it leaves Freeport. And then the operator of that, or the engineer or the crew for that train, gets to sort those cars out by customers once they reach the individual towns along the way. Okay. So here's Dubuque Yard. Dubuque is a major stop, division point, last stop before Iowa staging. A couple of things are shown on here. I've got the reversing loop which goes through that little hole in the wall, comes out the other side, comes back into the room. This is also the switching lead for Dubuque Yard from that end. 3 of the major customers in Dubuque are Dubuque Wholesale Foods, the Cargill Transload that I mentioned earlier, Star Brewery down here at the bottom right, and right here in front, the track at the bottom here is the main line, and the next track in is the arrival departure track for Freeport. And as you go out the top left of this picture and around the turn, you'll head toward Iowa staging. Here's a copy of that routing card that I showed you a moment ago that's parked here for the Yardmaster in Dubuque, and bill boxes here in Dubuque for the yard. And up at the top of the picture, there's a bill box also for the individual customers. So as cars are delivered or picked up from the individual customers, the bills are there. Rockford Yard. Rockford actually doesn't look too busy today. Rockford reversing loop is behind this first building. Main line comes in through a hole in the wall behind that first building. And again, there's a main line. There's also a second track, an arrival departure track up there as well. Yard for Rockford, for the Rockford operator. Staging track for Milwaukee is also through that little hole in the wall, as well as Chrysler plant, Belvedere track for the Chrysler plant. Didn't have room to model Chrysler. That would have been fun to do. But I represent Chrysler with a staging track, and cars are simply sent into that staging track. Here's engine terminal in Wallace Yard and Freeport. First track shows the local switchers for Freeport. Second and third and fourth tracks have engines for the turn jobs, the fur balls, and Freeport looks kind of busy at the moment. There are a couple of other engines sitting there as well. Turning around, here's the rest of Freeport Yard. And I have 2 trains going through Freeport at the moment. The IC grain train from Cedar Rapids to Hawthorne Yard in Chicago is sitting on the main. And right next to it on the arrival departure is Chicago Northwestern's Chicago to Owine train. And both of those, I think, are ready to depart. I think their work is, well, the grain train was a through train. It wasn't going to do any work. I think the Northwestern train has finished its work. It's ready to depart as well. Here's Portage Junction. And I noticed the Portage turn has recently run, bringing cars from the Blackhawk to the BN for pickup. And their cars going both east and west. Burlington's BN is going to have to sort those cars out and pick up the appropriate train. There'll be a BN train. You saw those trains in the staging yard, one in each direction. Those trains will have to pick up their cars from that staging track. And those are not organized as they're set on the track. So the BN crews are going to have to sort that out before they leave. The BHL tracks, Blackhawk line tracks, are the ones in the middle here, and the BN, or the tracks to BN staging, are the ones that pass directly in front of the interlocking tower. Here's the other end at Dunleith. It's a much shorter track. I don't have as much room here, but it looks pretty full too. And again, Since the portage turn has just run, these are all cars for the BN that will be picked up by one or the other of those two trains as they go through. Minneapolis staging is off to the upper left, and Blackhawk trackage to Dubuque is going up here to the upper right. This is what I call lacrosse block, which is the trackage as it leaves Dubuque, and the entrance to staging back here. We'll do some work, some scenery work in this area one of these days, make that look a little bit better. But this again pretty much follows the prototype. The IC looped through a bluff, came out through this hole in the wall, crossed the BN, and crosses the Mississippi River right here. So one of the fortunate things in the plan was I was able to duplicate that prototype trackage through this area. Here's the prototype view taken from Dubuque. You can see the IC trackage coming out through the bluff and then heading directly to the bridge across the river. The other picture, we were kind of fortunate to catch a towboat going through the bridge, and you can barely see a BN train on the other side passing by as well.
I was going to tease you, Bob, about saying the prototype went through a wall, but it actually does.
It really does.
What is that, Bob, before you go on, what is that you're using for the road bed? It looks a little different.
The road bed is, let me go back to that one. That's Homosote.
Okay.
We cut kerfs into the Homosote so that we could bend it.
Okay, great.
But it's just, at the moment, it's just track on Homosote.
Right. It just looked a little different than what I was used to.
Yep.
Is it painted on top, or what's that?
I'm sorry?
It looks like something's on top of it. Is there a layer of paint or something on there?
The track has been painted. Yeah, the track has been painted in this area. If this is what you're referring to, those are cardboard shims.
Okay, all right.
I had a couple of soft spots or low spots in the Homosote, so I had to shim that up a little bit.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay. So here's the railroad. The SC2 is a Sioux City to Chicago, so it's an eastbound train. Looks like we got a lot of IC traffic in that train today. Here's a different train. This is Des Moines to Chicago. CN train, CNW train, and it is just entering Wallace Yard. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Comments, questions?
Very good. Thanks, Bob. I've muted everybody, so just go ahead and unmute yourself if you have questions or comments.
I have a couple, if I may. You used the term furball, and maybe you explained it. I did not catch it. That'd be one question. And then if you can explain that one. And then I was wondering on the transload at the Cargill facility, do you have a specific time, or when a car comes in, do you just flip the card? Does the yard master flip the card? Or is there a time period you have on the transload on a car?
Sure. First question was with regard to the furballs. Furball was actually the name of was a name that was given by the crews to a local turn that ran out of Freeport back in the day. The original term came from the eastbound turn, which ran from Freeport to a city east of between Rockford and Elgin called Burlington. So the initials for the train were FRBL. Well, obviously that's furball. And so that name was just too good to pass out. And so we captured the name of furball and gave it to that turn. I think over the years, the crews applied that term to both east and west turns. So they both became known as furballs. But the original came from the Freeport to Burlington local turn. Second question was on the grain cars at the elevator in Dubuque. And generally, what I will ask the crews to do is to allow about 5 to 8 minutes, somewhere between 5 to 8 minutes on the fast clock for unloading cars. So the cars are pulled into the unloading shed, left there for a period of 5 to 8 minutes, and then pulled on through. And that gives the operator, that gives somebody an operating job at the elevator. Takes time to work those cars through, but it's a necessary job, and the idea is to get those cars through the elevator and back out into the yard so that they can be put into trains and moved on out of town to new destinations.
Thank you.
All right. Well, any other questions or comments?
Well, I guess I can ask one more if I may.
Yeah, sure.
In Minneapolis, a lot of us have, we got a clean track now and then. And I'm just curious about, it looked like very tight tolerances in that Minneapolis, how it's completely covered. How about does a derailment occur once in a while that you have to go in there, or maybe cleaning of track? Does that become a problem at all?
It can. I'll be honest with you. I haven't cleaned the track in Minneapolis staging in a long time. Partly because it's covered, it doesn't seem to get quite as much dust as the open yards do. And the open yards are a lot easier to clean. That track should be cleaned in Minneapolis. It's probably due to be cleaned. I do occasionally get a derailment, but I can't say that I've had a problem with derailments because of dirt. I've had a problem because switches weren't thrown right, but that's a different issue.
Yep. Operator, thank you.
Bob, how do you align those switches in staging?
Oh, I don't know if the picture shows that or not. Let me see if I can go back.
I saw some toggle switches.
They are there. No, it's not in this one. It's right here. Can you see my mouse pointer? Right in the center, just in front of Minneapolis is a panel with a rotary dial, and you dial the track that you want to go to.
Okay, dial it, then push a button to activate it.
It's a diode matrix that controls it.
Okay.
So you simply dial the track that you want. There are 9 tracks in there.
And are those tortoises underneath?
Those are tortoises underneath Minneapolis, yes.
So underneath Minneapolis, down to the other staging.
The other staging yards, Chicago has tortoise machines underneath it to control that yard throat, and that is the yard throat is right at the bottom of this picture, and the tortoise machines are there, so they're accessible. don't ask me why I did this. I can't remember now, but I did not put tortoises in Iowa. Those are basically caboose hand throws.
Okay, probably because in between the lower and the middle, I'm not sure if do you have room for tortoises in there?
In Iowa, yes, I would.
Okay. I forget which one was between the bottom one and the top one. Okay, yeah, you would have room. Okay.
Yeah, Minneapolis ends right here at that throttle pocket, and there would be room for tortoises in there. I don't remember why I did that. There was a reason, but I've forgotten what it was. Must have been that I was too lazy to put them in.
There you go. That'll work.
That's a good one.
Okay.
Bob, you use one car card box per town, basically,
Yes.
and most of the other guys, John and others, have box for each industry. Was there a reason behind that? Just less boxes?
Most of the towns that I've got don't have that many industries, frankly. Don't have that many cars, and it was easier just to put up one box for the town and have the crews sort that out. It's not that many cars. Freeport, as you know, has boxes for the east side and the west side. So I have east end customers and west end customers. But again, it's one box at that end, and there are some different customers at each end.
Just a little difference that I've run across between different places I go to.
Yep. Rockford is probably the most challenging in that because there are several customers in Rockford, and I did not bother to sort those bills out by customer.
Sometimes, Alan, I feel like I was trying to keep the car card box makers in China busy.
Yes, I agree.
I have a friend who has helped me with the layout, who made the boxes on my layout. I appreciate what he did, and he made a number of them, and he made them in different sizes for me. Most of the towns have fork pocket boxes for set out, hold, pick up, and off spot. But as you can see in this picture, the view for of the staging yards, I think there are 8 pockets on that, one for each of the tracks.
Yep, that makes sense.
Bob, you said sometimes your operators are confused as to top, middle, and bottom. Do you have them labeled top, middle, and bottom for the yards there? Or?
Yes, I do. You can see the label on this first box. This is for Chicago. Iowa staging is back in the view. It's just to the left of that control panel, and then Minneapolis is all the way at the end, and they are all labeled.
And is the F-15 on top coming in on runway 9 at O'Hare, or?
Well, he's actually a student pilot, and he's very confused. He wants to get to Glenview Naval Air Station. He's asking for vectors reward, and I don't know why.
But he's flying an Air Force airplane, so that's Glenview's not going to let him land.
Maybe that's why he's going to Ord.
Well,
I'm just an old ex-naval aviator, Bob.
Well, that's okay. So's my son.
beautiful. Well, thanks, Bob. That was a great presentation, very informative, and you covered the subject well. So thanks everybody for coming. I wasn't paying too close attention, but we came close to 30 people today. And so we got a little publicity in the Michiana Forum 19 newsletter. So we've got a couple of new people that joined us, and thanks guys for doing that. Make sure you send me an email so I can make sure that you get on the weekly notification. But we generally meet at this time at 6:30 Central, 7:30 Eastern on Thursdays. And of course, everybody's welcome. So we have a recording of this. We're getting towards 7:30, so I think we'll postpone the the introductions until next week. And so we'll have more information coming out about that. But thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks very much for Bob for preparing the presentation and giving it. It was excellent. And we'll see everybody in a week.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Good enough. Thanks. Good job.